Humanist Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Hello, and welcome to the New Orleans Humanist Perspective, brought to you by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association. My name is Beth Deitch, and I'll be your host for this show. I'm membership coordinator for NOSHA, and I'm on the board. You can go to nosha.org for more information about the organization and about secular humanism. My guest for today is Alexandra Miller, who is a principal at the urban design firm of Asakura Robinson. Got that right, here in New Orleans. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what your firm is about, because you said it's very much has, even though not a nonprofit, has a sort of a orientation more like a nonprofit would.
Yeah, so we are an urban planning, urban design, and landscape architecture firm that is really focused on living our values by working with underserved communities in particular to realize outcomes that include economic development in an equitable way, that include community development that is really fueled by the wishes of members of that community, that includes sustainable development that manages water in sort of green ways in addition to using pipes and other things, or that really values parks and open space access for all. So those are the kinds of projects that really excite us and that we try to do most of our work in those areas.
So what have you done here in New Orleans?
Sure. So we're doing a number of projects here in New Orleans. This is our newest office, although I've been in New Orleans for about 7 years. So we started this office about 2 years ago. And since then, we're working on a number of projects with the city, some green infrastructure projects, like some of the ones that folks here may have heard of that manage water using kind of rain gardens or other things like that actually, keep it and help it absorb into the soil rather than pumping it all out right away.
Right.
And we also are doing some work on kind of how we spend our public dollars and making sure those are furthering our planning goals and our, sort of things like equity and inclusion are included in all of the public incentives and other things that we're spending. And we've done some work with the cultural office, looking at cultural career paths and thinking about how cultural workers can have more sustainable
career paths.
Cultural
what
career
does that
paths.
mean?
Yeah, so we did this project with the Office of Cultural Economy that we finished, and actually there's a report out right now, I think, or will be coming out very soon. Some research funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, and what they really wanted to know was, how are cultural workers advancing in their careers? What do cultural careers really look like in New Orleans? Because there's a lot of speculation around
I don't know that term, cultural worker.
Yeah, so they have a sort of specific definition of it that's based in their kind of analysis that they do every year of the cultural economy, but it includes everything from folks who do entertainment like music and dance, folks who do visual arts, people in the food industry, people who do crafts and sort of design professions, preservation, so like architectural work and other things are counted in there. So it's a very diverse array of folks that they think of as constituting something that New Orleans is really, that's a huge benefit to New Orleans. And so they've wanted to sort of track it in a number of ways over the last few years. And I think this was one of their latest projects where they said, what do folks who are actually working in these various industries, how do they come to New Orleans? How do they get to work in these industries? What's the difference between folks who have been in New Orleans for a long time and folks who may be newer? You know, I think is a big question lots of folks are asking, and so they wanted to know about that. How did Hurricane Katrina really affect folks' careers? You know, and those who are back especially, how are they faring? And so all those questions were important to them when we did that work.
So who are your clients in these projects? Are the city, you're working for our local government?
So I work for the local government sometimes. I actually do work in Texas a lot as well, and across the country on some things. We have a really strong specialty in planning around vacant properties. And so, you know, obviously from New Orleans, we get a lot of experience with that. My first job was actually, this was back before I joined the firm, but we did a community toolkit for a neighborhood called Zion City, funded by the Foundation for Louisiana.
I saw that. It was like blight.
Yeah, the blight organizing toolkit. And so it really took folks through all the different aspects of vacant property, from how do you look up who owns a vacant property? How do you map the vacant properties in your neighborhood, and what might you want to record about them? And then, you know, if you actually know who owns something, you know, what do you do about it? You know, how do you actually contact them or send them a letter? What would you do to report them to the city, and for what, you know, in different ways? What are the policies about how you as a community organization might be able to get control of some of the properties in your neighborhood, depending on who owns them and how long they've been vacant and other things? So, you know, it's just all of the things that, because what we had heard was there were a number of toolkits talking about if you have a vacant property, what you do with it, right? How do you design a community garden? How do you do these other things? And what we had heard was there's a gap because folks don't actually know how to get a hold of this. Or even how to find out who would own it.
When did you start doing that?
That was started in 2014, I believe.
Because I would walk my dogs around my neighborhood. I live uptown, and see these just architectural gems that were just left to go to ruin. And it's like, and it would just break my heart. I'm going, this is going to be like a house-colored, house-shaped big pile of cat claw soon enough, you know. And something happened about 3 years ago or so. It seemed like, I don't know if it was just took that long for things to get through the pipeline, but there seemed to be a critical point where suddenly they were purchased by people and fixed up, but it took forever. I mean, they sat there for years after Katrina, just housing rodents and growing cat claw. And I had no idea who owned these things. So they pretty much all have been snapped up now, but there was definitely that critical time period where it was like, oh, you can finally, because as I understand it, the process is really slow to take something from someone who's neglecting it.
So, you know, there are it's really state law that determines how fast or slow that process is, and there are some states that are very strict about it, that just say, you know, if you haven't paid your taxes for 3 years, the property immediately goes to some public entity. And that has its advantages and disadvantages too,
and that's not Louisiana.
Exactly. But that is not Louisiana. So Louisiana is a very strong property rights state. They don't want, you know, folks to be able to take your property, and I get that. You know, I think that there's virtues to both of those things.
Right.
And so, but here it is, that does mean that there are, it's difficult to have the right tools to exercise in that situation. And so governments, I think actually, around then is probably when you started seeing some of the effects of the code enforcement efforts that the current administration put into place to really move these properties through a system that they felt legally could stand up to kind of title issues and other things.
Right, because nobody wants to put money into developing a house that someone else might come and claim it back.
Exactly.
Right. And so speaking of development, that sort of gets us to the one topic that when I mentioned to you, you said, oh yeah, I would love to come and talk to you about that, is the idea of gentrification. And you know, the word gentrification has very negative connotations. And the idea being that people get displaced by new, more wealthy, whiter, often out of town people moving into some of our more culturally rich neighborhoods, and actually perhaps destroying the culture that they're coming to experience in the process. So how would you address that as an act? Do you get accused of encouraging gentrification?
You know, we try very hard not to create strategies that do that, honestly. And I think it's because we are so aware of this issue. So I've actually, I think, spent a lot of my career in New Orleans trying to find alternative development strategies that actually address that. And what I will say is that it's difficult in a lot of ways. And the main way is that there are too few resources to address the problem nationally, not just in New Orleans, but everywhere.
Right.
And that's because of a number of things. That includes, you know, ultimately this is based on urbanization and market pressures from folks who often, you know, whose parents may have left the cities, or, you know, and in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, when cities were not, you know, felt to be a great place to be, especially for white people, honestly. And now, you know, folks are really love the urban feel and the mixed use and the fact that you can walk everywhere. And that's been great for a lot of cities in some ways because it's increasing their tax base and other things. But at the same time, what it means is that folks who have been kind of systematically denied opportunities throughout all of that time because there were not assets here and resources are now saying, you know, hey, I was able to invest something in this neighborhood, I've been here, and now you folks are coming in and I can't pay my property taxes anymore. And how is that fair, right? And that's a national issue. That's not just New Orleans. Now, New Orleans, this is complicated by the Katrina issue.
Right.
And what Hurricane Katrina did was really accelerate that process in a lot of ways, is what I would say, because it made sure that folks who really did not have a lot of assets would have a hard time coming back.
Right. Yeah, part of that change in demographics is just from who didn't even come back in the first place.
It created a lot of asset losses, you know, so folks who would ordinarily have passed down their homes through their families may no longer have had a clear title, or they have had a deed issue, or just were never able to really get the full amount to recover your house because of the way that Road Home and other programs were structured. And so there was, you know, we lost 100,000 black residents of New Orleans ultimately after Hurricane Katrina, and we've gained wealthier white residents. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that the benefits of post-Katrina growth have been very unequal. And so what we see is, especially in New Orleans, there's a very strong, you know, sort of wage issue. There's a huge inequality issue where, you know, we have a lot of folks who are working very hard, you know, honestly, maybe 2 or 3 jobs, often in the service economy where you earn $7.25 an hour.
At best.
And at best.
If you're waiting tables, you don't even earn that.
That's right. It's not guaranteed. And so that's not enough to pay for housing in the post-Katrina market unless you go way out to the fringes, you know, of the city, and even then it may not be enough. And so that's the hard part.
Something about what our rent is now, our median rent, and it is way up from what it was before Katrina, for sure.
It's more than double. And one of the reasons for that is that you can't rebuild rental property for the prices that properties that, you know, maybe had some maintenance issues, but were fundamentally sound, you know, were renting for before Katrina. So there's no way to rebuild a property and rent it for $400 a month because you can't, the monetary, it doesn't work. You know, you have to pay more than that in your loan to pay the bank back for building that property. And so it's not possible unless you have lots of subsidy and resources. And we did have lots of resources after Katrina, and and a lot of rental got rebuilt. I don't want to minimize what's been done. I mean, rebuilding. But
now it got rebuilt, but then rebuilt at what rate?
Well, and I think even a lot of affordable rental did get rebuilt. And so I want to give credit to the folks who've been working very hard to redevelop that affordable housing. But it hasn't been enough, I think. And I think everyone would agree that we need more affordable rental properties and affordable homeownership.
That more than 70% of our households are paying more than a third of their income just on their housing.
It's really a crisis. And it's not going to get better without a number of things: investing more in our, you know, affordable housing, finding new ways to create affordability, where, you know, whether forcing the market to create some affordability, creating incentive packages that allow it to be created, and just really applying every tool we can think of, particularly in a time when federal resources are very uncertain in the future.
I saw something called a smart housing mix as a phrase over it. Is that's some kind of program?
That's a proposed program that would require developers of larger scale multifamily buildings to include 12% affordability in their projects in return for, I think, an as yet unspecified package of incentives.
So that's at the city level?
That's at the city level. So that would include, you know, probably a density bonus, maybe some money.
Density bonus, what does that mean?
So that means you can add additional units or size to your project, and that means it can go either up or it can go out, or it can just occupy a little bit more space than it otherwise would, and so you get ultimately more income because you're able to have more units total. Now, there are certain projects for which that doesn't work because it's a historic building and you can't change it. And so there you may need to explore other options like giving them a little bit more money or finding a parking reduction or just things. It's kind of a program where you have to be a little bit customized to make sure that you're doing something that's not going to stifle development altogether.
Right.
But we think it's an important way to address this challenge. And it's not the only way, but it's one of the ways.
Well, and those would those last for a limited amount of time? Because I'm thinking of the whole American Can Company fiasco, where it was 20 years, was it? And then they didn't really prepare, and it was like, hey, you're out as of January.
And I think that's been a huge wake-up call, the American Can, kind of issue for housing preservation as a whole, and that's not something that's going to end. These terms expire, and they, for federal requirements, expire after 15 to 30 years, depending on when you build the thing. And so, our earliest post-Katrina, renovations or other things are going to be coming due, and we really need to be paying attention to that.
And is anybody paying attention to that?
They are, actually. I think, and I actually think that preservation, since American, I think there were folks paying attention to it before. I think since American Can, there's a lot more people who are understanding the real ramifications of that for our affordable housing stock.
And probably paying attention to when terms do expire, because it seemed like that just caught everybody off guard. So they'd forgotten that it was going to come up to. So I was looking at your little blurb on your website, and notice it says that you very much, and you said this to me just a little bit ago, want to help residents shape their own urban environments. And I asked you about this phrase of leveraging bottom-up community development strategies with connections to regional resources in order to create real community-driven improvements in local opportunities and quality of life. That's your specialty as described. Can you give us that in English?
Sure. I know that's a lot of jargon, and I think I need to eliminate the word leverage from my vocabulary. But it's really about how do we ensure that we are creating plans that really rely on the assets of a particular community and that value those.
How do you do that?
The way you do that is honestly by real community engagement, first of all, right? You can't just go into community and say, oh, well, I've got all this data, and so this is what you need. You actually have to go in and listen to folks and say, what are you looking for, right? And just saying, what do you want, I've actually found is always a bad idea, right? Because there are real opportunities and constraints that affect at least short-term options for each community, right? Not necessarily always long-term options, because you can always have a vision that's going to take you in a certain direction. But making sure that people are aware of kind of, okay, this is where, according to our research, your real estate values are, and this is what that means in terms of what you're likely to see. This is where, for your vacant properties or other things. This is, according to our research, where local incomes are, and here's some types of jobs that are available very close by that might be able to, have folks connected to if we just partnered with, somebody who has this kind of training or something else. So giving people a sense of the options, without necessarily predetermining and saying, here's what you need, and we know what you need.
Do you find it's hard to get people to trust you?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
I would imagine that they go, we've heard people come in and ask us these questions before, and nothing ever happens.
And nothing happens, right? And we don't take trust for granted ever. And I think that's and we go back and we talk to folks, and you know what? There are folks who won't ever trust us, and that's okay, as long as we can at least have a conversation with them and talk about the results or the issues they're facing, the results they're looking for, what folks in their families' hopes might be for the future, things like that, and then try to make sure that we're incorporating a lot of that information into the strategies that we're putting together.
So how exactly do you get, where do you go to talk to people? If you just wander around on the street, I imagine you're not going to get a lot of useful information. And that's definitely something that I've heard from a lot of people who are concerned about their neighborhoods, is that there doesn't seem to be good avenues of communication between people who want to help revitalize communities and the people who live in communities. And so, they won't necessarily even know what is going on with each other.
And so we try to do a combination of things. We pull together, meetings, as all planners do. You're always, whether they're public meetings for everybody, you try to do meetings with the community leaders directly and try to get folks' take on what's needed. But then you also do a lot of going where people are. And that just varies depending on what the community is like and what options there are. You can go to a festival or an event. You can go to a community center. You can go to a park on the weekend. You can go wander around the street, honestly. You can do door to door. It just depends on what, assets there are that that you can go see, and where there will be people, and how, kind of who you're looking to reach as well, I think matters. So, if I know there's a lot of families in the neighborhood, based on my research, I'm going to go to a park. Right, or a community center. If I know that there's a lot of seniors, I'm going to try to find the local senior center. So it just depends on who you're looking for.
So I found you, I got to know you because you have offices in the same building where I'm running a co-working desk in the Myrtle Banks building, which is over the Dryads Public Market, which is a fabulous market that you should check out if you haven't done so. And that is definitely a neighborhood in transition right now. Central City that, a few years ago, all people would think of was, gang warfare and blight, and it is now really sort of starting to be refurbished with the taking O.C. Haley itself down from 2 car lanes to the 1 lane in the bike paths and the nice little neutral ground. And I see there's a few blocks where they've taken and built some cute little houses that seem to sell just like that. But then there's still blocks that are kind of, and you get a couple blocks off of O.C. Haley, and there's still a lot of pretty run-down homes that are, I don't know if they're rented or if they're owned by people of very modest means, but then what are their reactions to seeing, is it, because nobody wants to live in a crappy crime-ridden neighborhood, so it's nice, I imagine, for everybody if things are cleaner and all, and more services and the city paying more attention. But then there is the question of, do they feel like this is for me, or this is for someone else who's going to come in here and I'm going to be driven out?
Yeah, and I think O.C. Haley is actually a fairly good example of this is for me to some extent. I mean, I think that there's always room for growth there, but you have assets like Ashe that are on O.C. Haley that are truly of the community. That really, you have, the small center from Tulane that's our community design center that's located on Barone, just off O.C. Haley. You have Dryads Market, which I think has done a great job of community hiring. You have,
and I think their current renovations that they're trying to make it more grocery store-like, and how it's designed, and I think they're hoping to become more of a community grocery and store, with a lot of fresh foods and sort of a cheaper alternative to Whole Foods, which I know a lot of lower-income communities often have a dearth of healthy food options. So it'd be nice if that kind of became a community center.
Now, I think one thing that we may be lacking on O.C. Haley, or that we could use more of, is real community-owned businesses, right? So you see like a place like Bayou Road, in like right off of Broad Street, and that's a place that has a ton of honestly Black-owned businesses that are folks who live in that local community, who've been there for years. Everything from the Cocoa Hut to Community Book Center, which is another fantastic resource that folks should absolutely check out if you have the time. And that really serves as a bookstore, but also a community meeting space and gathering space. Lots of really fantastic businesses over there. And those are the kinds of things that I think would really, those are great opportunities for really any district in the city to try to attract more of. One thing I used to do, actually, before I came to work at the firm was work for an organization called Crescent City Community Land Trust. And community land trusts are really dedicated to they're about community development. So they're not, often people hear the words land trust and they think about like big tracts of land out west and kind of preserving those. Community land trusts actually tend to work in urban areas, and they develop permanently affordable housing. Both on the rental and homeownership sides, and then what our land trust was doing.
How do you make permanently affordable housing?
So you let me get into that in a second. I'm going to tell you about this other thing that we did. It's a little complicated. So the other thing that we were doing was a commercial land trust model, which was trying to create affordable commercial space that we would own and control and be able to use as kind of an incubator. But less than, your usual incubator is about, tech firms or other things. And so this was really going to be more about like small businesses and retail businesses and other things. And I think that organization is still working on creating that space. They've invested in the Pythian, this downtown development that actually has a public market on the ground floor and some permanently affordable rental above. So permanently affordable housing is basically secured by the land trust having a percentage of ownership in the property in perpetuity.
Okay.
And there's an agreement between the land trust and the owner or the renter. If it's a rental, then the land trust just secures it by their percentage of ownership. If it's home ownership, it's actually the land trust signs an agreement with the owner of the house and says, you are going to be okay reselling this. At the end, you're going to get this at a reduced price, but you're going to resell it to somebody at the same income level down the road. And hopefully as incomes grow, that person still sees a percentage of the appreciation. They'll see all of their equity back, right? As long as the market doesn't crash. But they won't necessarily, they'll see a certain amount of appreciation.
Yeah.
But not, if it's a neighborhood, especially that's going from, $100,000 houses to $300,000, okay, they're not going to realize that whole amount, but they are going to preserve that affordability for the next family and keep that neighborhood mixed income.
Okay. Yeah. So what do you say to people who say that this sort of development is, it destroys the unique culture of New Orleans?
What kind of development?
There seem to be people who almost feel like poverty is part of it, of that neighborhoods where everyone on the block came from it's from the same family, practically extended family, has been there forever and ever.
Yeah.
And probably cannot all afford to take advantage of some of the newer developments, or there are people who still want to get back after Katrina, and they say these things aren't going to help them. And I don't necessarily think it's a valid criticism, but there are definitely, I've heard it from people of saying, that this makes us not the unique place that we are. So how would you answer that?
So I guess what I'd say is that we, as a city, we need more population, right? And we were a 600,000 person city at one point. We are a city built for 600,000. We have 400. And that's not really a sustainable model. You don't have the resources you need to maintain your infrastructure, right? And so we have streets that are problematic and sidewalks and other things, right?
Yeah.
And so we can't live like that. The problem is, I think, that, like I said, we don't necessarily have the resources, or at least necessarily, and we haven't always been using them in the right way to lift everybody up when you actually do this kind of development work. And so that, I think, needs to be a central focus, because what we've seen is that as the development's been happening, we've been getting further apart. And now we need opportunities to bring ourselves back together. And I think that, for me, would be something that would preserve the culture of New Orleans, is if we could eliminate this inequality.
Well, that's great. That's and we're just about out of time, so that's a really good note to wrap up on. Certainly, that is, I think, the hope of all of us, that this development can lift everybody's, lift all boats, as they say. And I personally love that we're kind of starting to get some of the good things of the 21st century without leaving behind our centuries-old culture at the same time.
Gotta keep working on it, but we're gonna get there.
Yeah, eventually. All right, well, thank you for watching The Humanist Perspective, and we will be back next time with some guests who are going to talk to us about their summer camp experiences at religious camps, and so that should be pretty interesting.